Hey everybody, it's John here at John's DIY Playground. I hope you're ready to have some fun at the playground today because I've got a DIY job here. My under cabinet lighting LED strip connector is kind of busted here. The connector's no good anymore. So today I'm just going to solder a little pigtail on here. So I'm going to do a quick DIY on soldering, how to solder, what to do, and how to make it look really professional using heat shrink tubing. So I hope you stick around. To get started here, let's talk about the basic tools we have to use for this job. We got, of course, wire strippers here, some wire cutters, solder, of course, and you have to pick what size you want. I've got a 1mm diameter here, and some heat shrink tubing. I picked this up at Harbor Freight. There's an assortment of sizes. Go ahead and pick up some kind of heat shrink tubing, and now let's talk about the bigger part of the tools of the job, the power tools. That's going to be the heat gun and the soldering irons. Alright, for the heat gun, I don't have too much to say or recommend other than you need something that's going to blow hot air hotter than a dryer. So heed the warning on this thing. It says caution. Don't use it as a blow dryer because the temperature gets over 400 degrees. That's lovely. This is a heat gun I probably bought 30 years ago. It's 1,000 watts. It's deluxe, of course, you can see. If you want to make it even hotter, you can turn down this knob to make it blow less airflow. 3 modes. It turns on, it gets hot. Hit it the second time with the switch, it gets cool off the element. Third time turns it off. So it's really easy. Real easy to use, does the trick, and that's all you need to use heat shrink tubing. Now as for soldering irons, there's a lot of ways to go with this. This is kind of what I was using most of my life with electronics. It's a what they call like a pencil type iron. It doesn't have any kind of heat control. You just plug it in and use it. This one's made by Weller. It's 12 watts. It can get the job done when you just need to have something around and handy. It's a fairly cool tip. It won't damage real sensitive electronics, but it's really kind of just for beginners, and if you can just spend a few more dollars, which I'll talk about in a minute, I'll show you a little bit better soldering iron for the money. Now this isn't the iron that's better for the money I was talking about, although it does cost more money. It's a Radio Shack 230 watt and 150 watt. This thing is a monster, and it's got a monster tip on it. Heats up real quick with trigger action. It's got a low and a high setting depending how far you push in the trigger, but I would not recommend this whatsoever for any kind of electronic soldering or for the tiny little wiring job we're going to do today. If you have to solder together some really thick or heavy gauge wires, like a 12 or 14 gauge wire, this is great. But really, you do not want to get anywhere near a circuit board with this thing. It will melt your components. So do not get this, but I just wanted to cover this type of trigger iron. Alright, now for the money, I would say go out there and spend the $30 or so it costs to purchase this AOU, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Chinese built soldering station. Like I said, they're only about $30 now. It doesn't come with this part. This is about an extra 10 bucks, but I'll talk about it in a second. This is a 60 watt iron system, and it's got a 0 through, let's say, an 8 setting for high. So it's temperature variable, and it really keeps up when you're soldering a lot of things. This is the US 110 volt version of it. It has this nice holder for it so it doesn't get hot and starts things on fire around you. I used to use a wet sponge to kind of clean the tip before I would use things, but now I use this kind of Brillo pad looking thing. It stays dry and it actually does a really nice job cleaning the tip, so I'd highly recommend that in addition to this soldering station. Okay, we're ready to start this job. So the first thing I'm going to do is get this clipped off of here and this one clipped off of here. I don't want that connector anymore. I'm going to just take my wire end clippers and clip that off of there. And I'm going to clip this one off of here. It is important to note that this is an LED project, so polarity matters, so positive and negative are going to matter. This pigtail has a little black stripe painted on it, and so does my other side. So when I go to solder these two together, I need to remember to make sure that the black stripe goes with the black stripe wire and the other one goes with the other one. So I'm just going to clip this apart so that I can spread them and strip it so that I can expose some of the copper wire. And then we'll go ahead and I'll show you how I'm going to prepare the heat shrink tubing before I do the soldering, because you want to get that staged before we put the whole thing together. It's very important. So let me get that set up for you. For my heat shrink kit, what I did is picked a piece of heat shrink tubing that was just a little larger than the size of the wires, and I cut the heat shrink tubing in half. It's a little bit longer than what I needed. Order of operations is important here. I put one of the pieces on here. I'm going to put the other piece on the other side here. But you always want to put the heat shrink tubing on first when you're going to join a couple wires, because you're going to need to slip them over after they're joined. Imagine this is a really long wire and you can't just separate these completely apart like I could have, but I'm trying to demonstrate if you had a really long wire what you would do. So I've got my heat shrink tubing on there, and again, this is an LED, so I need to be careful about positive and negative. So I've got the negative to negative wire here that I'm going to just twist together to start with. Just give it, put the two together, give it a couple twists, and do the same thing on the positive side here. Whoops, my negative just came off. We just want to secure these wires temporarily until we hit them up with the solder, and then they'll be stuck together permanently, which is why I like to solder and not just twist wires together, because when you twist them together they tend to wiggle loose. Alright, now we've got the wires twisted together, we're ready to solder them permanently. So I've got my Tenma solder. It's a 60-40 solder that has a rosin core. Pretty common stuff, 1mm diameter. Just take your soldering iron, and I've got this thing fired up only for about a minute, which is great. It heats up real quick. It's on a setting of 5 out of 8. I never really go any higher than this. In fact, I go lower when I do circuit board work. But for just soldering these two wires together, we just want to get the soldering iron tip onto the wire, warm it up a little bit, and then we're just going to touch the solder on there. And we have to hold it for just enough time where you start to see the solder flow on the copper, and it's very distinct when it starts to happen. You'll see that you've got kind of like a ball of solder sitting there, and then all of a sudden, boom, it starts to flow. And when you're done soldering, just kind of touch the tip again and throw it in there before you put it back on the holder. If your solder joint is kind of like a dull gray, then that's a cold solder joint. You do not want that. You need to turn up the heat of your soldering iron or leave the iron on there longer. The soldering iron joint should look shiny and silvery when it's done, like this one. Once it's to this point, what I'm going to do is just clip the solder joint down a little bit so there's not so much there. I'm going to pull the heat shrink tubing over the joint, and then we're going to actually shrink it down. I'll show you that next. Alright, so I just clipped a little bit of extra copper off the soldering joint there, and now what I'm going to do is just take the heat shrink tubing and peel it over. I guess you kind of have to wiggle it because this was a pretty tight diameter that I chose to get the heat shrink tubing over the solder joint. But if you work it back and forth a little bit, it's almost at times some of this heat shrink tubing is so it only shrinks so much, so you don't want to necessarily choose a really huge wide piece of heat shrink tubing because it won't shrink down tight like it should. You can see I'm having a little bit of trouble here, but I'm just kind of working the joint so that it's bent into a round, I guess is how I could explain it. But I kind of got it here. I'm going to work it a little bit more off camera, but you can see this one is over the solder joint, and then I'm going to work this one next. And for the essence of time, just cut this short, and then we'll go and shrink the tubing up. So like I mentioned, I really had a little bit of a struggle here getting this heat shrink tubing on. So turns out that it looked like I put my soldering iron a little too close to the end of the heat shrink tubing and kind of shrank it up a little bit from the heat of the soldering iron. So to remedy that, you can always take a utility knife and then just kind of take it and make a little bit of a slit in the area where it's shrunk up, and that'll help just open it up and let you slip the heat shrink tubing over the soldering joint so that it looks like this. So now you can see there's a little bit of gap there. I'm going to shrink it up just using the heat gun. So all you have to do is take your handy dandy heat gun, let it heat up for just maybe 10 seconds, 20 seconds. You'll feel it get hot if it blows on your skin and you go, ow, you know it's ready. Just going to heat this up real quick. Needs maybe 15 seconds total. So my last clip there, the video wasn't so easy to hear. I guess the audio wasn't so easy to hear when I was had the heat gun right in front of the mic. But you can see this turned out pretty nice. I'm real happy with the heat shrink. But to go from pro to super pro, one last piece of heat shrink, a little bit bigger than both of the wires. Throw that over the end and cover up your two wires so that they're stuck together in the future and cannot separate and won't separate your wires any further. This will just cap off the job beautifully, and I'm just going to hit this for 10 seconds with a heat gun as well, and I'll show you the end result when it's done. Alright, so that got so hot, if you notice closely, even my table was starting to bubble up from the heat of this heat gun. So this is it. It's all done, and I'm just going to put this back into place in my kitchen countertop, and we should be good to go. Brand new LED lighting with without any connectors. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did like it, please give me a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel so that you know when more videos come out. Thanks for watching John's DIY Playground. I'll talk to you later.